Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on something historians rarely discuss. What happened when the crowds went home and the gladiators were left alone with their thoughts, their wounds, and occasionally their freedom? So settle in, get comfortable, maybe grab that blanket you've been meaning to wash for 3 weeks, and let's explore the after-hours world of Rome's most famous warriors. Picture this. It's 2 a.m. in ancient Rome. The Colosseum is empty, except for the occasional rat scurrying across blood-stained sand, and in the gladiator barracks, men who spent the day trying to kill each other are now sharing watered wine and comparing scars. It's like the world's most dangerous night shift, except instead of stocking shelves, you're processing trauma and planning your next survival strategy. The gladiator barracks. Or Ludus wasn't exactly a luxury resort. Think more like a combination prison, training camp, and group therapy session run by people who thought empathy was a Greek word for weakness. These weren't spacious Roman villas with marble columns and decorative fountains. They were functional, cramped, and about as welcoming as a tax audit conducted entirely in Latin. Most gladiators slept in small cells, barely large enough for a person and their existential dread. The walls were thick stone, partly for security, and partly because ancient Romans believed thin walls led to thin character. Each cell had a simple wooden bed, if you could call a plank with a straw mattress a bed, and maybe a small window that showed just enough sky to remind you what freedom looked like. But here's where it gets interesting. After the day's training or fighting, when the guards weren't watching quite so closely, the gladiator community came alive. These men, and sometimes women, formed bonds that went beyond simple camaraderie. They created families, support systems, and informal networks that helped them survive, not just the arena, but the psychological weight of their existence. Gladiators developed their own economy within the barracks. Skilled fighters who survived multiple bouts earned respect, which translated into better treatment, extra food, and sometimes small luxuries like oil for wounds or decent sandals. They'd trade skills, too. A veteran might teach a newcomer how to read an opponent's tells in exchange for help with equipment, maintenance, or a share of winnings from betting pools. Yes, gladiators bet on each other. Nothing builds team spirit quite like wagering your week's bread ration on weather. Marcus will remember to keep his shield up this time. These informal gambling rings created complex social hierarchies based not just on fighting ability, but on trustworthiness, wit, and the kind of street smarts that kept you alive when strength wasn't enough. The medical care in gladiator schools was surprisingly sophisticated for the time. Not out of compassion, mind you, but because dead gladiators don't sell tickets. Each ludus had a medicus, a doctor who specialized in treating the kinds of injuries you get when your job involves sharp objects and angry opponents. These physicians developed techniques for treating cuts, broken bones, and concussions that were advanced even by modern standards. Gladiators learned to be their own medics, too. They knew which herbs could reduce inflammation, how to clean wounds properly, and when to push through pain versus when to admit defeat. Veterans would pass this knowledge to newcomers, creating an informal medical school where the tuition was paid in blood and the graduation ceremony involved not dying. The relationship between gladiators and their trainers, called lanista, was complex. These men owned the gladiators, trained them, and decided who fought whom and when. Some lanista were former gladiators themselves, who understood the psychological challenges their fighters faced. Others were businessmen who saw human beings as investment portfolios with varying rates of return. Smart Lannister learned that gladiators who felt valued, or at least not actively despised, performed better. This led to small privileges like better food, occasional visits from family members, or permission to keep personal items. A gladiator might earn the right to wear a particular charm into battle, or to have a say in choosing opponents, or even to keep a portion of prize money. But the most important currency in the gladiator world wasn't money or privileges. It was hope. Hope came in many forms: the possibility of earning freedom through exceptional performance, the chance to become a trainer rather than just a fighter, or simply the prospect of surviving long enough to see another sunrise. Some gladiators saved every coin they earned, planning for the day they might buy their freedom, or at least secure a better position within the system. The famous gladiator Spartacus started his rebellion not in the arena, but in the quiet moments between fights, when hope had transformed into desperation, and desperation had crystallized into action. His story shows us that even in the most oppressive systems, human beings find ways to dream, plan, and occasionally reshape their world entirely. Religious and spiritual practices flourished in the gladiator barracks. Men facing death regularly developed intense relationships with various gods, from Mars, the god of war, to Nemesis, the goddess of revenge, to more exotic deities imported from across the empire. They'd create shrines in their cells, using whatever materials they could find, offer prayers before fights, and develop rituals that helped them process the constant proximity of death. These weren't just individual practices. Gladiators would gather in groups to perform ceremonies, share stories about fallen comrades, and maintain oral traditions that preserved the memory of fighters who had achieved legendary status. They created their own mythology, turning the arena from a place of death into a stage where heroes were born, even if those heroes usually died shortly afterward. The social dynamics extended beyond the barracks. Successful gladiators became celebrities in Rome, with fans who followed their careers, collected merchandise, and even formed fan clubs. Some gladiators leveraged this fame into relationships with wealthy patrons who might sponsor their careers or help them achieve freedom. It was an early form of sports marketing, except the endorsement deals were literally matters of life and death. Food in the gladiator schools was functional rather than appetizing. The basic diet consisted of barley, beans, dried meat, and olive oil, designed to build muscle and maintain energy rather than provide pleasure. But gladiators found ways to make meals more bearable and more social. They'd pool resources to buy spices, share cooking duties, and turn meal times into community gatherings where they could discuss strategy, gossip, and maintain the human connections that kept them sane. Some gladiators became skilled cooks, learning to prepare meals that boosted performance and aided recovery. Knowledge about nutrition spread through the community like any valuable skill, with recipes and techniques passed from veteran to newcomer, alongside combat training and survival strategies. As we drift from the world of gladiators, imagine those moments of quiet solidarity in the barracks, when warriors who had spent the day trying to kill strangers would spend the night caring for each other's wounds. sharing stories, and finding ways to remain human in a system designed to make them into mere entertainment. Their legacy wasn't just in the arena, but in how they maintained dignity and community under impossible circumstances. This resilience would echo through history, influencing how people in desperate situations would find hope, create bonds, and sometimes change the world. And it's this thread of human persistence that leads us naturally to another group who knew something about surviving systems that seemed impossible to change. The Night Watchers, who kept Rome's streets safe, or at least safer than they would have been otherwise. Speaking of people who worked while others slept, let's talk about Rome's Vigiles, the night watchmen who kept the eternal city from burning down, getting robbed, or descending into complete chaos after dark. These were the men who patrolled Roman streets when most citizens were safely tucked behind locked doors, dealing with everything from house fires to drunk senators to the occasional escaped exotic animal from private menageries. The Vigiles were created by Emperor Augustus around 06 CE, not out of humanitarian concern for public safety, but because Rome kept catching fire, and fire has this annoying habit of not respecting property lines. When your city is built mostly of wood and clay, with narrow streets and buildings packed together like sardines in a very flammable tin, you need people whose job it is to notice when things start glowing orange in the middle of the night. Originally, there were 7 cohorts of Vigiles, each responsible for 2 of Rome's 14 regions. Each cohort had roughly 500 to 1,000 men, depending on the emperor's budget and how recently the city had experienced a major disaster. These weren't volunteers motivated by civic duty. Most Vigiles were freedmen, former slaves, who had earned or bought their freedom and needed work that didn't require extensive training or social connections. The Vigiles worked in a world without streetlights, where the only illumination came from oil lamps flickering in windows, the occasional torch, and moonlight when clouds weren't being uncooperative. Navigating Roman streets after dark was like trying to find your way through a maze designed by someone who held a personal grudge against straight lines and logical city planning. Their primary job was fire prevention and firefighting, using equipment that would make modern firefighters laugh and then cry. They carried leather buckets, long-handled axes, wet cloths, and vinegar-soaked sponges. For major fires, they had pumps and water supplies. But fighting a blaze in ancient Rome was less about sophisticated equipment and more about organized panic, hoping the wind didn't shift. The Vigiles developed techniques for creating fire breaks by demolishing buildings in the path of flames. This required quick decision-making about whose property to sacrifice, which often led to arguments with homeowners who weren't thrilled about having their houses torn down to save their neighbors. Imagine trying to explain to someone at 3 a.m. that you need to destroy their bakery to prevent the whole neighborhood from becoming an unplanned crematorium. But fire wasn't their only responsibility. The Vigiles also served as night police, dealing with crimes that flourished in the darkness. Roman streets after sunset were hunting grounds for thieves, con artists, drunk aristocrats causing trouble, and various forms of what we might call late-night antisocial behavior. Robbery was common, especially targeting people foolish enough to venture out alone wearing anything that suggested they had money. The Vigiles patrolled in groups, carrying lanterns and weapons, announcing their presence with calls and sometimes music to let both criminals and law-abiding citizens know they were in the area. They weren't trying to be stealthy. They wanted potential troublemakers to know that the night wasn't completely lawless, even if it wasn't exactly safe either. Their authority was somewhat ambiguous. They could arrest people, but their jurisdiction overlapped with other Roman law enforcement groups, leading to turf wars and bureaucratic confusion that would be familiar to anyone who's ever worked in a large organization with unclear management structure. A vigil might apprehend a criminal only to have a urban pretor show up and argue about who had the right to handle the case. The Vigiles developed their own culture and traditions. They lived in station houses called excubatoria, which served as barracks, equipment storage, and local headquarters. These buildings were strategically located throughout the city, positioned to provide quick response to fires and to serve as safe havens for Vigiles who might need backup or medical attention. Life in the Vigiles wasn't glamorous. The work was dangerous, the pay was modest, and the social status was low. Romans looked down on manual labor, and firefighting definitely counted as manual labor, albeit the kind that involved running toward danger instead of away from it. Vigils were seen as necessary, but not respectable, useful, but not admirable. However, the job came with certain benefits. Vigils received regular wages, which was more financial security than many Romans enjoyed. After serving for 6 years, they could earn Roman citizenship, a significant social and legal upgrade that opened doors to better opportunities for themselves and their families. This promise of advancement motivated many freedmen to join the Vigiles despite the risks and low status. The Vigiles also served as an informal intelligence network. Patrolling the streets at night, they observed who was coming and going, which businesses were thriving or struggling, and where social tensions were building. This information was valuable to city administrators and sometimes to the imperial government, making the Vigiles more than just firefighters and beat cops. Training for Vigiles was practical rather than formal. New recruits learned on the job, paired with veterans who taught them how to recognize fire hazards, handle basic equipment, read the signs that trouble was brewing in a neighborhood, and survive encounters with hostile citizens who didn't appreciate being told to put out their cooking fires or stop beating their neighbors. The Vigiles developed specialized knowledge about Roman architecture, an urban layout that made them experts in predicting how fires would spread and which buildings were most vulnerable. They knew which neighborhoods had the best water access, where equipment was stored, and which residents could be counted on to help versus which ones would flee at the first sign of smoke. Equipment maintenance was a constant concern. Leather fire buckets needed regular treatment to prevent cracking. Axes required sharpening, and pumps needed cleaning and repair. The Vigiles became skilled craftsmen out of necessity, learning to maintain and improvise with tools that could mean the difference between containing a small fire and watching an entire district burn. Social relationships within Vigiles units were strong, forged by shared danger and mutual dependence. These men worked together in life-threatening situations, relied on each other for backup during confrontations with criminals, and shared the peculiar bond that comes from having a job that most people are grateful exists but don't want to do themselves. The Vigiles also interacted with Rome's other night workers, bakers who started work before dawn, prostitutes who worked evening shifts, tavern keepers who served late-night customers, and various merchants who moved goods under cover of darkness to avoid daytime traffic congestion. These relationships created informal networks of information and mutual assistance that helped maintain some semblance of order in the nocturnal city. Religious practices among the Vigiles often focused on protective deities. They made offerings to Vulcan, the god of fire, asking for protection from the flames they fought, and to Minerva, goddess of wisdom, hoping for the quick thinking that could save lives and property. Some units developed their own shrines and rituals, creating spiritual communities that strengthened their professional bonds. The Vigiles dealt with Rome's social contradictions on a daily basis. They were expected to protect the property of wealthy citizens who looked down on them, to risk their lives for people who saw them as barely above slaves, and to maintain order in a system that created many of the problems they were supposed to solve. This required a particular kind of psychological resilience and practical wisdom. Weather presented constant challenges. Summer fires spread faster and required more water. But winter brought its own problems. Frozen water supplies, slippery streets that made rapid response difficult, and the increased use of heating fires that created more opportunities for accidents. The Vigiles had to adapt their tactics and equipment to seasonal conditions while maintaining round-the-clock readiness. Some Vigiles rose through the ranks to become officers, gaining respect and better pay, but most remained ordinary watchmen throughout their careers. The successful ones were those who combined physical courage with diplomatic skills, who could fight fires effectively and also negotiate with angry property owners, calm panicked neighbors, and work cooperatively with other Roman officials. The Vigil system lasted for centuries, evolving with Rome itself. Later emperors expanded their authority and improved their equipment, recognizing that urban safety was essential for political stability. The Vigiles became a permanent feature of Roman life, as much a part of the city's infrastructure as aqueducts or roads. Their legacy extends beyond firefighting and crime prevention. The Vigiles represented an early form of professional public safety services, a recognition that complex urban societies require organized responses to predictable problems. They showed that even in hierarchical systems, essential services could create opportunities for social advancement and civic participation. As we follow the Vigiles through their dangerous, thankless rounds, checking for fires, breaking up fights, and trying to keep Rome from destroying itself one night at a time, we can see how their work connected them to every level of Roman society, from the slaves cooking late dinners to the aristocrats stumbling home from dinner parties. Everyone depended on these night watchers, and their intimate knowledge of Rome's hidden rhythms naturally brings us to those who knew the city's secrets even better, the people who cleaned up after everyone else, who entered homes and public spaces when others weren't watching, and who saw the private reality behind Rome's public magnificence. Now let's turn our attention to the people who made Roman civilization possible, but whom history barely remembers. The vast army of cleaners, sweepers, waste collectors, and maintenance workers who kept the eternal city from drowning in its own filth. These were the people who worked in the shadows, literally and figuratively. making sure that Rome's glory didn't collapse under the weight of Roman garbage. The scale of waste management in ancient Rome was staggering. With over 1 million inhabitants at its peak, the city generated enormous amounts of human waste, food scraps, broken pottery, worn-out clothing, and the general detritus that accumulates when large numbers of people live in close proximity. Without modern sanitation systems, this cleanup required an army of workers who functioned like biological processes in a massive urban organism. Street cleaning in Rome was both a public necessity and a private enterprise. The city employed official street sweepers, usually slaves or poor citizens, who worked dawn to dusk, removing the previous day's accumulation of garbage, animal droppings, and various substances that people had thrown, dropped, or deposited in public spaces. These workers used simple tools, brooms made from bundled twigs, and the kind of strong backs and stomachs that could handle work most Romans preferred not to think about. But street cleaning was just the visible surface of a much more complex system. Private homes, especially wealthy ones, generated their own substantial waste streams that required specialized handling. Kitchen scraps, ashes from heating and cooking fires, broken household items, and human waste all needed to be removed regularly to maintain livable conditions. The workers who entered Roman homes to handle these tasks occupied a unique social position. They were intimate with family secrets, witness to private behaviors, and handlers of materials that revealed everything about their employers' lives. What people threw away told stories about their wealth, health, eating habits, relationships, and personal hygiene that they wouldn't share with their closest friends. Wealthy Roman households employed teams of specialized cleaners. There were workers who focused on kitchens, dealing with food waste and grease that could attract vermin or create health hazards. Others specialized in cleaning sleeping areas, handling chamber pots, washing linens, and maintaining the spaces where families were most vulnerable. Still others maintained public areas of homes, cleaning floors, walls, and the decorative elements that displayed family status to visitors. These cleaners developed sophisticated knowledge about materials and techniques. They knew which substances could remove different types of stains, how to clean delicate fabrics and artwork without causing damage, and how to handle waste in ways that minimized health risks. This knowledge was passed down through informal apprenticeships, creating professional traditions that sustained families and communities across generations. The economics of cleaning work in Rome created complex relationships between workers and employers. Some cleaners were household slaves who performed these duties as part of their general service. Others were free workers, often former slaves, who contracted their services to multiple households. Still others were specialists who handled particular types of cleaning that required specific skills or equipment. Payment for cleaning services varied widely. Slave cleaners received food, housing, and clothing, but no wages. Free cleaners might be paid daily wages, given food and lodging as part of their compensation, or work under longer-term contracts that provided some security in exchange for exclusive service. The most skilled cleaners, those who could maintain valuable artwork or handle delicate materials, commanded premium rates and developed reputations that attracted wealthy clients. Working conditions for cleaners were often harsh. They handled materials that were dirty, smelly, and sometimes dangerous to health. Chemical cleaning agents of the time included substances like ammonia from urine, lye made from ashes, and various acids that could cause burns or respiratory problems. Cleaners worked with minimal protection, relying on experience and folk wisdom to avoid the worst occupational hazards. The social invisibility of cleaning work meant that these workers moved through Roman society largely unnoticed, overhearing conversations, observing family dynamics, and gaining access to information that could be valuable or dangerous. Some cleaners became trusted confidants of their employers, privy to secrets that could affect business deals or political careers. Others used their access for less legitimate purposes, gathering information for blackmail or theft. Cleaning workers developed their own communities and support networks. They shared information about employment opportunities, warned each other about dangerous or unreliable employers, and created informal insurance systems to help members who became ill or injured. These networks also served social and cultural functions, providing marriage partners, childcare assistance, and the social connections that made life bearable for people whose work isolated them from mainstream Roman society. The tools and techniques of Roman cleaning were surprisingly sophisticated. Cleaners used different types of brooms for different surfaces, specialized scrubbers for removing stubborn stains, and chemical treatments that could dissolve grease, remove odors, or sanitize surfaces. They understood principles of hygiene that wouldn't be formally recognized by medical science for centuries, using practices that prevented disease transmission even when they didn't fully understand the mechanisms involved. Water management was crucial to cleaning work. Cleaners needed access to clean water for washing and rinsing, but they also had to manage wastewater in ways that didn't create new problems. They developed systems for filtering and treating water that allowed multiple uses before final disposal, maximizing efficiency in societies where water access required significant labor and expense. Waste disposal presented constant challenges. Organic waste could be composted or fed to animals, but only if it was handled properly and quickly. Broken pottery and other non-organic materials had to be carted away to designated dump areas outside the city. Human waste required special handling to prevent contamination of water supplies and living spaces. Some cleaning workers specialized in particular types of waste. There were workers who focused on collecting and processing human waste, turning it into fertilizer for agricultural use. Others handled industrial waste from workshops and manufactories, dealing with byproducts from metalworking, textile production, and food processing. Still, others managed the waste streams from public events, cleaning up after gladiator games, theatrical performances, and religious festivals. The cleaning of public buildings and spaces required different skills and organization than private household work. Public baths, temples, theaters, and government buildings were used by large numbers of people and required constant maintenance to remain functional and presentable. Teams of cleaners worked around the clock to keep these facilities operating, often coordinating their efforts to minimize disruption to public activities. Religious and cultural practices surrounding cleanliness influenced cleaning work in important ways. Romans associated cleanliness with moral purity and social respectability. creating demand for cleaning services that went beyond basic sanitation. Cleaners who worked in temples or prepared spaces for religious ceremonies had to understand ritual requirements and maintain standards of purity that had spiritual as well as practical significance. The seasonal rhythms of Roman life affected cleaning work significantly. Summer brought increased waste from fresh foods and higher temperatures that accelerated decomposition, requiring more frequent waste removal and more aggressive pest control. Winter reduced some types of waste but increased others, particularly ashes from heating fires and the mud and debris tracked indoors during rainy weather. Training for cleaning work was informal but thorough. New workers learned by observing and assisting experienced cleaners, gradually taking on more responsibility as they demonstrated competence and reliability. The best cleaners developed reputations for skill and discretion that allowed them to work for wealthy and influential families. Sometimes for decades, some cleaners were able to use their positions as stepping stones to other opportunities. Their intimate knowledge of wealthy households sometimes led to positions as personal servants, estate managers, or even business partners in ventures that required understanding of upper-class Roman life. Others used savings from cleaning work to invest in small businesses or to purchase freedom for family members who were still enslaved. The health challenges faced by cleaning workers were significant but often unrecognized. Constant exposure to waste materials, chemical cleaning agents, and contaminated water led to respiratory problems, skin conditions, and digestive illnesses. The physical demands of the work, particularly the heavy lifting and repetitive motions involved in waste removal, caused chronic pain and mobility problems that worsened with age. Despite these challenges, many cleaning workers took pride in their contributions to Roman society. They understood that their work was essential to public health and social order, even if it wasn't celebrated or well compensated. Some developed innovations in cleaning techniques or waste management that improved efficiency and working conditions, contributing to the practical knowledge that sustained Roman urban life. The relationship between cleaning workers and other household staff created complex social dynamics. Cleaners often had the lowest status among household workers, but their specialized knowledge and access to family secrets gave them a form of power that complicated simple hierarchies. Successful cleaners learned to navigate these relationships diplomatically, building alliances that protected them from abuse while advancing their interests. As we follow these invisible workers through their daily routines, emptying chamber pots, scrubbing floors, hauling away refuse, and maintaining the cleanliness that Romans equated with civilization itself, we see how their labor supported every aspect of Roman life. Their work made possible the leisure, learning, and political activity that we remember when we think of Roman achievements, and their intimate knowledge of how Romans actually lived, as opposed to how they wanted to be remembered, connects us naturally to others who knew the gap between Roman ideals and Roman reality. The people who provided another essential but underappreciated service. The wet nurses and childminders who raised the children of the wealthy while often being separated from their own families. From the world of those who cleaned up after Romans, we move to those who nurtured the next generation of Romans. The wet nurses and childminders who raised aristocratic children while navigating complex relationships between maternal duty, economic necessity, and social hierarchy. These were women who sold the most intimate aspects of their biology and emotion, providing not just milk but mothering to children who weren't their own. Wet nursing in ancient Rome wasn't just a job. It was a social institution that revealed everything about Roman attitudes toward class, gender, and family relationships. Wealthy Roman women routinely hired other women to breastfeed their children, not necessarily because they couldn't nurse themselves, but because doing so was seen as beneath their station, potentially harmful to their figures, or incompatible with their social obligations. The wet nurse market in Rome was surprisingly sophisticated and regulated. Families seeking nurses looked for women who met specific criteria. They should be young but not too young, healthy but recently delivered, of good character but not too independent, and preferably attractive but not so attractive as to tempt the master of the house. It was like hiring someone for the most intimate possible job while trying to minimize every possible complication. Wet nurses came from various backgrounds, but most were slaves, freedwomen, or poor citizens who had recently given birth and needed income more than they needed to nurse their own children. This created one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the wet nurse system. Women were often forced to wean their own babies prematurely in order to provide milk for the children of wealthy families who could pay for their services. The process of selecting a wet nurse involved examinations that would be considered invasive by modern standards. Potential employers or their representatives would inspect candidates' breasts, test the quality and quantity of their milk, examine their teeth and general health, and investigate their moral character and family background. Medical writers like Serranus provided detailed guidelines for choosing wet nurses, treating the selection process like a livestock purchase with very specific quality requirements. Once hired, wet nurses entered into relationships that were intimate yet carefully circumscribed by law and social custom. They lived in their employers' households, shared their daily routines, and developed emotional bonds with the children they nursed. But they remained legally and socially subordinate to the birth mothers who employed them. This created complex dynamics of affection, authority, and resentment that could last for years. The daily life of a Roman wet nurse revolved entirely around the needs of her nursing charge. She was expected to be available for feeding on demand, which in practice meant being constantly accessible and having little control over her own schedule or activities. Her diet, health, and behavior were monitored and regulated because anything that affected her could potentially affect the child's well-being. Roman medical writers provided extensive advice about managing wet nurses, including what they should eat, how much they should sleep, what activities they should avoid, and how their emotional states should be managed. These recommendations were based on theories about how a nurse's physical and mental condition could influence the character and health of the children they fed, making wet nurses responsible not just for nutrition but for moral development. Compensation for wet nursing varied considerably depending on the nurse's status, the employer's wealth, and the specific terms of employment. Slave wet nurses received no direct payment but might be rewarded with better treatment, additional food, or promises of eventual freedom. Free wet nurses negotiated contracts that specified payment schedules, living arrangements, and the duration of service. The most successful wet nurses were those who could balance the competing demands of their position, providing genuine care and affection for their charges while maintaining appropriate social distance, satisfying their employers' expectations while protecting their own interests, and managing their own grief at separation from their biological children, while forming new attachments to their nursing charges. Wet nurses often remained with families for years beyond the nursing period, transitioning into roles as childminders, personal servants, or even trusted household advisors. Some developed such close relationships with their charges that they became permanent members of extended households, caring for multiple generations of the same family and wielding informal influence that exceeded their official status. The children raised by wet nurses grew up with complex relationships to both their birth mothers and their nurses. Many developed stronger emotional bonds with their nurses than with their biological mothers, leading to family dynamics that could persist into adulthood. Some successful Romans maintained lifelong relationships with their former wet nurses, providing financial support and showing public respect that acknowledged the maternal role these women had played in their development. The wet nurse system created networks of relationships that extended far beyond individual households. Nurses often worked for multiple families throughout their careers, carrying information, maintaining connections, and serving as informal communication networks among Rome's elite families. They became repositories of family histories, keepers of secrets, and witnesses to the private dramas that shaped Roman society. Training for wet nursing was informal but comprehensive. Experienced nurses taught newcomers about childcare techniques, household management, and the social skills necessary to navigate complex family relationships. This knowledge was passed down through generations of women, creating professional traditions that sustained communities of care workers across the empire. The health challenges faced by wet nurses were significant and often unrecognized. Continuous nursing could lead to malnutrition if their diets weren't properly supplemented. Breast infections were common and potentially serious, and the emotional stress of caring for children while separated from their own families took psychological toll that was rarely acknowledged or addressed. Religious and cultural practices surrounding childbirth and nursing influenced the work of wet nurses in important ways. They participated in rituals designed to protect children from harm, learned prayers and ceremonies that were believed to promote healthy development, and sometimes served as intermediaries between families and the gods who protected children and mothers. The seasonal rhythms of Roman life affected wet nursing in various ways. Birth patterns followed seasonal cycles that influenced the availability of wet nurses and the demand for their services. Economic cycles affected payment and working conditions, while political upheavals could disrupt households and force nurses to seek new employment or adapt to changing circumstances. Some wet nurses were able to use their positions to advance their own interests and those of their families. Their intimate access to wealthy households sometimes led to opportunities for their own children to receive education, training, or patronage that wouldn't otherwise have been available. Others leveraged their knowledge of upper-class Roman life to establish small businesses or make advantageous marriages. The legal status of wet nurses was complex and varied depending on their personal circumstances and the specific terms of their employment. Slave nurses had no legal rights and could be sold or transferred at their owner's discretion, but they might earn promises of freedom through faithful service. Free nurses could negotiate contracts and had some legal protections, but they remained vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. Child-minding duties often extended well beyond nursing to include education, discipline, and social training. Wet nurses taught children their first words, basic social skills, and moral principles, making them crucial figures in early childhood development. Some nurses were specifically chosen for their educational abilities as well as their nursing capacity, particularly in households that valued Greek culture and learning. The relationship between wet nurses and the biological mothers who employed them was often tense and complicated. Birth mothers might resent their dependence on other women for what was considered a fundamental maternal function, while wet nurses might feel underappreciated for providing essential care while receiving little recognition or security. These tensions were managed through elaborate social protocols that defined appropriate behavior for both parties. Wet nurses developed specialized knowledge about child development, nutrition, and health care that made them valuable beyond their nursing function. They learned to recognize signs of illness, manage feeding schedules, and provide comfort during the inevitable difficulties of early childhood. This expertise was recognized and valued by families who employed the same nurses for multiple children or recommended trusted nurses to friends and relatives. The geographic mobility required by wet nursing work meant that many nurses traveled extensively throughout the Roman world, following families who moved for business or political reasons, or seeking new employment when circumstances changed. This mobility gave wet nurses broader perspectives on Roman society than many women of their social class typically experienced. Some wet nurses achieved unusual prominence and recognition for their contributions to famous families. Historical records mention nurses who were honored by their former charges, included in wills, or remembered in family genealogies alongside biological relatives. These exceptional cases highlight the potential for intimate service relationships to transcend normal social boundaries. The end of the nursing relationship presented challenges for both nurses and families. Children had to be weaned not just from milk, but from their primary attachment figures, while nurses faced the loss of income, housing, and emotional connections that had structured their lives. Successful transitions required careful planning and sensitivity to the psychological needs of all parties involved. As we observe these women navigating the complex demands of providing maternal care within systems that fundamentally undervalued their contributions, we see how they created spaces for genuine affection and professional pride despite legal and social constraints. Their work sustained the families that ruled Rome while often requiring them to sacrifice relationships with their own children, and their intimate knowledge of how Roman families actually functioned behind the public facades of paternal authority and maternal virtue naturally connects us to others who knew the private realities of Roman domestic life. The house slaves who managed daily operations and witnessed the true dynamics of power, affection, and conflict within the homes of the wealthy. moving deeper into the private world of Roman households. We encounter the house slaves, who knew more about their masters' lives than most masters knew about themselves. These were the people who dressed aristocrats in the morning and undressed their secrets at night, who managed the daily operations that made Roman domestic life possible while observing the gap between public virtue and private reality. House slaves occupied a unique position in Roman society, neither fully part of the families they served nor entirely separate from them. They lived in the same buildings, ate food from the same kitchens, and participated in family celebrations and crises, but always as observers and servants rather than as equals. This intimate distance gave them perspectives on Roman life that were both privileged and painful. The hierarchy among house slaves was as complex as that among free Romans, based on skills, responsibilities, trust level, and personal relationships with family members. At the top were trusted personal servants, secretaries, and household managers who handled financial affairs and represented their masters in business dealings. At the bottom were general laborers who cleaned, carried, and performed the physical work that kept households functioning. Personal body slaves, called capsari or cubicularii, had the most intimate relationships with their masters. These slaves helped with dressing, bathing, grooming, and personal care, witnessing their masters in states of vulnerability that revealed physical imperfections, health problems, and private anxieties that were carefully hidden from the public world. The trust required for such intimate service could lead to genuine affection, but it also created opportunities for manipulation and abuse. Female house slaves faced particular challenges and opportunities within Roman households. Some served as personal maids to the women of the house, learning the secrets of Roman beauty routines, fashion, and social etiquette that could be valuable knowledge for their own advancement. Others worked in kitchens, nurseries, or general household maintenance, developing skills that could eventually lead to better positions or even freedom. The sexual vulnerability of house slaves, both male and female, was a constant reality that shaped their daily experiences and long-term prospects. Roman law and custom provided no meaningful protection against sexual exploitation by masters or their family members, and house slaves had to navigate these dangers while maintaining their value as workers and their hopes for eventual improvement in their circumstances. Kitchen slaves formed the backbone of Roman household operations, managing the complex logistics of feeding families, guests, and other household staff. They planned menus, shopped in markets, prepared elaborate meals for entertaining, and maintained the food storage and preparation areas that were essential to household status. The best kitchen slaves became skilled chefs whose abilities could enhance their masters' reputations and social standing. Household financial management often fell to educated slaves who served as secretaries, bookkeepers, and business managers. These slaves handled correspondence, maintained accounts, collected rents from properties, and sometimes represented their masters in business negotiations. Their access to financial information and business networks gave them knowledge and connections that could be valuable for their own future enterprises. Childcare responsibilities created some of the most emotionally complex relationships between house slaves and their masters' families. Slave, nurses, tutors, and companions often developed genuine affection for the children in their care, while those children formed attachments that could last into adulthood. These relationships sometimes led to unusual loyalty and protection, but they could also be sources of heartbreak when family circumstances changed. The daily schedules of house slaves were determined entirely by their master's needs and routines, leaving little time or energy for personal relationships or individual pursuits. They rose before dawn to prepare for their master's day and worked until their masters retired, often sleeping in small rooms within the house where they could be summoned at any time for unexpected needs or emergencies. House slaves developed sophisticated understanding of Roman social etiquette, political relationships, and cultural practices through constant observation and participation in their masters' lives. They learned to recognize the subtle signals that indicated changing family fortunes, political alliances, or social tensions that could affect their own positions and prospects within the household. Clothing and appearance of house slaves reflected their master's status while reinforcing their own subordinate position. Well-dressed slaves enhanced their master's prestige by demonstrating wealth and good taste, but their clothing was carefully regulated to prevent them from appearing too independent or socially elevated. The best-treated house slaves received decent clothing and personal care, while others wore simple, functional garments that marked their status. Religious and spiritual practices among house slaves often blended traditional Roman observances with customs from their places of origin and personal beliefs developed through their unique experiences. They participated in household religious ceremonies, maintained shrines to gods who protected servants and workers, and sometimes developed syncretic practices that combined multiple spiritual traditions. Education and literacy among house slaves varied widely depending on their backgrounds and the needs of their masters. Some slaves arrived in Roman households already educated, particularly those from Greek backgrounds or urban environments where literacy was more common. Others learned to read and write through their work, developing skills that increased their value and opened possibilities for advancement. The social networks created by house slaves extended throughout Roman society, connecting households through relationships between servants who had worked for multiple families, married partners from different households, or maintained friendships across social and geographic boundaries. These networks facilitated information exchange, economic cooperation, and mutual support that helped slaves navigate their challenging circumstances. Medical care for house slaves ranged from excellent to non-existent, depending on their value to their masters and the resources available within their households. Skilled or trusted slaves might receive medical attention comparable to that provided for family members, while others had to rely on folk remedies, mutual aid from other slaves, or simply endure illness and injury without treatment. House slaves often served as intermediaries between their masters and the outside world, carrying messages, conducting business, and representing family interests in ways that required diplomatic skills and sound judgment. The most trusted slaves wielded considerable informal authority, making decisions that affected household operations and family relationships while maintaining the appearance of simple obedience. The Economic lives of house slaves were complex despite their lack of formal wages. They received food, shelter, clothing, and sometimes small gifts or privileges that had economic value. Some slaves were allowed to accumulate personal property or even conduct small business activities, saving money that might eventually allow them to purchase their freedom or support family members. Punishment and discipline within households varied dramatically depending on individual masters, family traditions, and specific circumstances. Some house slaves experienced relatively gentle treatment and rare physical punishment, while others faced regular violence, humiliation, and abuse that left lasting physical and psychological damage. The arbitrary nature of their treatment was itself a form of control that reinforced their powerless status. House slaves witnessed and sometimes participated in the family dramas, political intrigues, and personal crises that shaped Roman elite society. They observed marital conflicts, business failures, political setbacks, and health problems that their masters tried to hide from public view, giving them intimate knowledge and humanity of people who held absolute power over their lives. The training and mentorship systems among house slaves created informal education networks that passed along practical skills, survival strategies, and cultural knowledge from experienced workers to newcomers. Senior slaves taught junior ones not just how to perform their duties effectively, but how to navigate the complex social dynamics and emotional challenges of household service. Some house slaves developed that made them particularly valuable and increased their chances of good treatment or eventual freedom. These might include artistic skills like music or decoration, technical abilities like accounting or correspondence, or interpersonal talents like entertaining guests or managing other servants. Specialization provided some protection against arbitrary treatment and opened paths to advancement. The geographic mobility of wealthy Roman families meant that house slaves often traveled extensively throughout the empire, accompanying their masters to different cities, provinces, and even foreign countries. This travel exposed them to diverse cultures and customs while providing opportunities to develop new skills and relationships that could be valuable for their future prospects. Retirement and old age presented particular challenges for house slaves who had no formal pension systems or guaranteed support in their declining years. Some longtime servants were rewarded with freedom and continued support from grateful masters, while others faced increasing marginalization and poverty as their physical abilities declined and their usefulness diminished. House slaves sometimes achieved positions of considerable responsibility and influence within their master's business and social networks, managing properties, supervising other workers, and making decisions that affected significant financial interests. These positions required intelligence, integrity, and diplomatic skills that were recognized and valued even within systems that denied their basic humanity. The intimate knowledge that house slaves possessed about their masters' private lives, financial affairs, and political activities made them potentially dangerous as well as valuable. Masters had to balance the convenience of trusted servants against the risks of having witnesses to their secrets and vulnerabilities, leading to complex relationships built on mutual dependence and carefully managed. trust as we follow these house slaves through their days of constant service, observing their masters' morning routines, managing complex household logistics, witnessing private family moments, and retiring to their small rooms with knowledge that could reshape Roman politics if it ever became public. We see how their labor sustained not just individual families, but the entire social system that defined Roman civilization. Their intimate access to power, combined with their legal powerlessness, created unique perspectives on Roman society that would eventually influence how Romans understood family relationships, social obligation, and the boundaries between public and private life. And their daily interactions with the children of wealthy families naturally leads us to those other servants who shaped young Roman minds through education and training. The tutors and pedagogues who transmitted culture and knowledge while navigating their own complex positions within households that valued their expertise while denying their independence. From the intimate world of personal service, we turn to those house slaves whose value lay not in their physical labor, but in their minds and education. The tutors and pedagogues who shaped the intellectual development of young Romans while occupying the peculiar position of being simultaneously respected for their knowledge and degraded by their legal status as property. Relationship between education and slavery in ancient Rome created one of the most fascinating contradictions in Roman society. Educated slaves, particularly those from Greek backgrounds, were highly prized for their ability to provide Roman children with the classical education that aristocratic families considered essential for social and political success. Yet these same slaves remained legally property, unable to control their own lives, despite wielding significant influence over the minds that would eventually rule the empire. Greek slaves dominated the tutoring profession in Roman households, not just because of Roman admiration for Greek culture, but because many Greeks possessed the linguistic skills, cultural knowledge, and pedagogical training that Roman parents wanted for their children. These slaves often arrived in Rome already educated, having been captured during military campaigns, or sold into slavery due to economic hardship. In their home cities, the daily routine of a slave tutor revolved entirely around their young charges, educational needs, and schedules. They rose early to prepare lessons, spent long hours teaching subjects ranging from basic literacy and mathematics to advanced rhetoric and philosophy, and often continued their duties into the evening by supervising homework, conducting discussions, or accompanying their charges to cultural events that supplemented formal education. Pedagogues, who were distinct from tutors, served as combination guardians, companions, and disciplinarians for Roman children. They accompanied children throughout their daily activities, supervised their behavior in public, and provided the constant adult supervision that wealthy Roman families considered necessary for proper childhood development. The relationship between pedagogues and their charges was often intensely personal, lasting for years and creating emotional bonds that complicated the fundamental inequality of their legal relationship. The curriculum that slave tutors were expected to deliver was comprehensive and demanding, covering grammar, rhetoric, mathematics, history, philosophy, music, and sometimes specialized subjects like medicine or law. They had to adapt their teaching methods to individual students' abilities and interests while meeting parental expectations about educational outcomes and maintaining discipline in households where they had authority over their master's children but no ultimate power to enforce it. Language instruction was a particular specialty of educated slaves, who taught Roman children not only proper Latin but also Greek, which was considered essential for anyone who aspired to intellectual sophistication or political prominence. Some tutors were native speakers of other languages valuable for trade or diplomacy, making them especially prized in households with international business interests or political ambitions. Social dynamics between slave tutors and their students created complex challenges that required diplomatic skills as sophisticated as their academic knowledge. Tutors had to maintain their students' respect and obedience while acknowledging their own subordinate status within the household hierarchy. They wielded temporary authority over children who would eventually become their social superiors, requiring them to balance educational effectiveness with long-term survival strategies. Payment and compensation for slave tutors varied significantly depending on their skills, reputation, and the specific arrangements made by their masters. Some tutors received no direct compensation beyond basic food and housing, while others earned small wages that allowed them to save money toward eventual freedom. The most valued tutors sometimes received promises of manumission in exchange for long-term service or exceptional educational results. The intellectual lives of slave tutors presented another fascinating contradiction. They were expected to be learned and culturally sophisticated, often more so than their masters. Yet they had limited access to books, lectures, and other educational resources that would have allowed them to continue their own learning. Some tutors managed to maintain their intellectual development through informal networks with other educated slaves or by gaining access to their masters' libraries and social events. Tutors faced additional challenges in Roman households, where gender expectations complicated their educational roles. Women tutors typically focused on teaching younger children or providing specialized instruction in areas considered appropriate for females, such as music, literature, or domestic arts. However, some highly educated women slaves taught advanced subjects to both male and female students, demonstrating intellectual abilities that challenged Roman assumptions about gender and learning. The physical and emotional demands of tutoring work were considerable. Tutors spent long hours on their feet, engaged in intensive intellectual activity, managing classroom behavior, and maintaining the energy and enthusiasm necessary for effective teaching. They also dealt with the stress of being responsible for educational outcomes while having little control over their students' motivation or family support for learning. Professional development among slave tutors occurred through informal networks and mentorship, relationships with other educated household staff. Experienced tutors shared teaching strategies, disciplinary techniques, and survival skills with newcomers, creating communities of practice that helped maintain educational standards and professional identity despite the challenges of their legal status. The relationships between tutors and parents were delicately balanced negotiations between expertise and subservience. Parents wanted tutors who were knowledgeable and effective, but not too independent or influential with their children. Tutors had to demonstrate their educational value while avoiding any appearance of undermining parental authority or developing relationships with students that might threaten family loyalty. Some slave tutors developed reputations that extended beyond individual households, becoming known for their expertise in particular subjects or their success with difficult students. These reputations could lead to better treatment, higher status within households, or opportunities to work for more prominent families. But they also made tutors more valuable as property and potentially less likely to be freed. The seasonal rhythms of Roman education affected tutoring work significantly. Summer months often brought reduced formal instruction, but increased opportunities for educational travel, cultural activities, and practical learning experiences that required tutors to adapt their teaching methods and maintain their students' engagement in different contexts. Advanced tutors sometimes served as bridges between their students and the broader intellectual community of Rome, facilitating access to lectures, libraries, and scholarly discussions that enriched the educational experience. These connections required tutors to navigate complex social networks while maintaining their subordinate status and protecting their students' interests. The health challenges faced by tutors included physical strain of standing and speaking for long hours, eye problems from reading in poor light, and the mental stress of constant intellectual performance under pressure. They also faced the occupational hazard of working closely with children, presented ongoing challenges for slave tutors, who had to maintain order and ensure learning progress without the ultimate authority that free teachers possessed. They developed creative strategies for motivating students, managing behavior, and securing parental support for their educational efforts while working within the constraints of their legal status. Some tutors specialized in preparing students for specific career paths or social roles, tailoring their instruction to meet the needs of future lawyers, politicians, military officers, or business leaders. This specialization required deep understanding not just of academic subjects but of Roman social expectations and professional requirements that would shape their students' adult lives. The emotional relationships between tutors and students often lasted well beyond the formal educational period, with some successful Romans maintaining contact with and providing support for their former tutors throughout their lives. These relationships demonstrated the genuine affection and respect that could develop despite legal inequality, and sometimes led to opportunities for tutors to gain freedom or economic security in their later years. Retirement planning for slave tutors was complicated by their lack of control over their own futures and the limited options available for aged household staff. Some tutors saved money and developed skills that would allow them to continue working after gaining freedom, while others depended entirely on their masters' goodwill for support in their declining years. The legacy of slave tutors in Roman society extended far beyond their individual contributions to specific students' education. They transmitted Greek culture and learning to Roman society, influenced the intellectual development of future leaders, and created educational traditions that shaped Roman approaches to learning and scholarship for generations. As we observe these learned slaves navigating the contradictions of their position, respected for their minds while owned as property, shaping the thoughts of future rulers while unable to control their own destinies. We see how they created spaces for intellectual dignity within systems designed to deny their humanity. Their work preserved and transmitted the cultural knowledge that Romans valued most highly, even as Roman law refused to recognize their fundamental equality. And their daily interactions with Roman children, teaching them not just facts and skills, but ways of thinking and questioning, naturally connects us to those other household staff who shaped young Romans through different kinds of training, the craftsmen and specialists, who taught practical skills and trades while serving as bridges between the theoretical education provided by tutors and the real-world knowledge that successful Romans needed to navigate their complex society. Moving from the realm of academic education to practical training, we encounter the skilled craftsmen and artisans who served Roman households not as general laborers, but as specialists whose expertise was essential for maintaining the lifestyle and status that wealthy Romans considered their due. These were the people who turned raw materials into the luxury goods, artistic objects, and practical items that filled Roman homes and demonstrated their owners' wealth, taste, and cultural sophistication. The skilled trades in Roman households encompassed an enormous range of specialties, from goldsmiths and silversmiths who created jewelry and decorative objects, to woodworkers who crafted furniture and architectural elements, to textile workers who produced the fine clothing and household linens that marked social distinction. Each craft required years of training, specialized tools, and the kind of knowledge that could only be acquired through experience and mentorship. Households created everything from utilitarian kitchen implements to elaborate ceremonial street objects used in religious rituals and public ceremonies. They worked with bronze, silver, gold, and iron, using techniques that had been refined over generations to produce objects of remarkable beauty and technical sophistication. The best metalworkers developed personal styles and reputations that made their work highly sought after by collectors and connoisseurs. The workshops where these artisans labored were often located within the household compounds of their wealthy employers, providing convenient access to their services while maintaining the privacy and security that Roman families valued. These workshops were equipped with specialized tools, furnaces, and workbenches that represented significant investments in equipment and infrastructure necessary for high-quality production. Textile work in Roman households involved multiple specialized roles, from spinners who prepared thread and yarn to weavers who created fabrics, dyers who produced the rich colors that Romans prized, and seamstresses who constructed the elaborate garments worn by wealthy families. The most skilled textile workers could produce fabrics of incredible fineness and complexity, using techniques that required both artistic vision and technical precision. Woodworking craftsmen created the furniture, decorative panels, and architectural elements that filled Roman homes with beauty and functionality. They worked with rare and expensive woods imported from across the empire, using joinery techniques that allowed them to create pieces that were both structurally sound and aesthetically pleasing. The best woodworkers were artists as well as craftsmen, creating pieces that displayed both technical skill and creative vision. Stone carvers and sculptors worked with marble, granite, and other precious stones, to create the decorative elements that adorned Roman homes and gardens. They produced portrait busts, decorative reliefs, architectural ornaments, and garden sculptures that demonstrated both their own artistic abilities and their patrons' cultural refinement. These craftsmen often worked on projects that took months or years to complete, requiring sustained concentration and artistic vision. The training systems for skilled artisans typically involved long apprenticeships, where young workers learned their trades through observation, practice, and gradual assumption of increasing responsibility. Master craftsmen passed down not just technical skills, but also trade secrets, quality standards, and business practices that sustained craft traditions across generations. These relationships often lasted for years and created strong bonds between masters and apprentices. Tools and equipment for skilled crafts represented significant investments that craftsmen had to maintain, repair, and constantly upgrade to keep pace with technological developments and changing aesthetic preferences. The best tools were often handmade by the craftsmen themselves or acquired through networks of specialized toolmakers who understood the precise requirements of different trades. Quality control in craft production was maintained through combination of personal pride, master supervision, and customer expectations. Craftsmen whose work failed to meet standards faced criticism, reduced opportunities, and potential punishment, while those who consistently produced excellent work earned reputations that could lead to better treatment and increased responsibilities within households or opportunities to work for other wealthy families. The seasonal rhythms of craft production were influenced by availability of materials, weather conditions that affected working environments, and the social calendars of wealthy families who commissioned specific pieces for particular occasions. Craftsmen had to plan their work around these constraints while maintaining productivity and meeting deadlines that were often inflexible. Innovation and creativity in craftwork were encouraged within limits set by traditional techniques and customer preferences. The most successful craftsmen found ways to improve efficiency, enhance quality, or create new decorative effects while working within established frameworks that ensured their products would meet social expectations and functional requirements. Material sourcing for skilled crafts often involved complex supply chains that brought raw materials from across the Roman Empire to urban workshops. Craftsmen had to understand the properties and potential of different materials while working within budgets and availability constraints that affected their creative choices and production methods. The relationship between artistic vision and practical constraints shaped every aspect of craft production in Roman households. Craftsmen had to balance their creative aspirations with technical limitations, material costs, time pressures, and customer preferences, developing solutions that satisfied multiple competing demands while maintaining their personal artistic integrity. Some craftsmen developed specializations within their trades that made them particularly valuable for specific types of projects. A metal worker might become known for religious objects, jewelry, or weapons, while a textile worker might specialize in particular types of fabric or decorative techniques. These specializations allowed craftsmen to develop deeper expertise and command higher respect for their work. The social status of skilled craftsmen in Roman households was complex and variable, depending on their specific trades, individual abilities, and relationships with their employers. Some craftsmen were respected for their expertise and treated almost as artists, while others were valued primarily for their productivity and treated as particularly useful slaves who happened to have specialized skills. Working conditions for craftsmen varied widely, depending on their trades and the resources available in their workshops. Some worked in well-equipped, comfortable spaces with good lighting and ventilation, while others labored in cramped, poorly lit areas that made their work more difficult and potentially dangerous to their health. The economic aspects of craft production in Roman households involved complex calculations of material costs, labor time, and finished product value that affected decisions about what to produce internally versus what to purchase from outside suppliers. Skilled craftsmen often participated in these economic discussions, providing expertise about production possibilities and resource requirements. Health and safety concerns in craftwork included exposure to dangerous materials, repetitive motion injuries, eye strain from detailed work, and accidents involving sharp tools or hot equipment. Craftsmen developed their own protective practices and treatment methods for occupational injuries, sharing this knowledge through their professional networks. Professional networks among craftsmen extended beyond individual households to include relationships with suppliers, customers, and other artisans who could provide technical advice, business opportunities, and social support. These networks were essential for maintaining quality standards and staying current with technological and stylistic developments in their fields. Some craftsmen achieved recognition that extended beyond their immediate employers, developing reputations that brought commissions from other wealthy families or opportunities to work on public projects. This recognition could lead to improved treatment, greater creative freedom, and sometimes even opportunities to establish independent businesses after gaining their freedom. The preservation and transmission of craft knowledge was a constant concern for artisan communities, who developed formal and informal systems for training new workers and maintaining quality standards across generations. Master craftsmen took responsibility for preserving trade secrets and traditional techniques while adapting to changing technologies and market demands. Competition among craftsmen within households and between different workshops drove innovation and quality improvement, but also created tensions that had to be managed carefully to maintain productive working relationships. The most successful craftsmen learned to balance competitive drive with collaborative cooperation that benefited everyone involved. The cultural significance of craft production extended beyond mere economic value to include roles in religious ceremonies, political displays, and social rituals that required objects of particular beauty, symbolic meaning, or technical sophistication. Craftsmen who understood these cultural dimensions could create pieces that had special value for their patrons and communities. Legacy planning for craftsmen involved decisions about how to pass along their skills, tools, and business relationships to the next generation of workers. Some craftsmen were able to train their own children or chosen apprentices to continue their work, while others saw their knowledge and achievements die with them due to the constraints of their legal status and social position. as we follow these skilled artisans through their daily routines of creating beautiful and useful objects, transforming raw materials into finished products that enhanced Roman life, and maintaining the traditions that connected their work to centuries of craft knowledge. We see how their expertise contributed to the cultural achievements that we still admire in Roman art and architecture. Their technical skills and artistic vision created the material culture that surrounded wealthy Romans, while their training and mentorship sustained the knowledge that made such achievements possible. And their work naturally connects us to those other specialists who contributed to Roman household operations through different kinds of expertise. The healers and medical practitioners who maintained the health and well-being of household members while navigating the complex intersection of medicine, religion, and social hierarchy that characterized Roman approaches to healing and healthcare. From the workshops where craftsmen created beauty and utility, we move to the chambers where other specialists worked to preserve life and health, the household physicians, healers, and medical attendants who provided healthcare services to Roman families while operating within a medical system that blended empirical observation with religious ritual, scientific theory with folk tradition, and genuine healing knowledge with treatments that were ineffective or actively harmful. Medical care in Roman households was provided by a diverse group of practitioners whose skills, training, and social status varied enormously. At the top of the hierarchy were educated physicians, often Greek slaves or freedmen, who had received formal medical training and could diagnose complex conditions, perform surgical procedures, and prescribe sophisticated treatments. Below them were various specialists, herbalists, midwives, and general caregivers who handled specific aspects of healthcare and daily medical needs. The daily routine of a household physician involved morning consultations with family members and staff, examination of patients with ongoing health problems, preparation and administration of medications, and supervision of other medical personnel who assisted with patient care. These physicians often served multiple roles, functioning as personal doctors, public health advisors, and medical educators within their household communities. Surgical procedures in Roman homes required specialized knowledge and equipment that only the most skilled physicians possessed. These practitioners performed operations ranging from simple wound care and bone setting to complex procedures like cataract removal, kidney stone extraction, and even some forms of brain surgery. The surgical instruments used by Roman physicians were sophisticated and specialized, demonstrating a level of medical knowledge that was remarkable for its time. Pharmaceutical knowledge among household medical staff was extensive and sophisticated, based on understanding of plant medicines, mineral compounds, and animal-derived substances that could be used to treat various ailments. Medical practitioners maintained gardens of medicinal plants, laboratories for preparing compounds, and libraries of medical texts that documented traditional remedies and experimental treatments. Women's healthcare in Roman households was typically managed by female medical practitioners who understood the special needs related to pregnancy, childbirth, and gynecological conditions. These practitioners, often called obstetresses or possessed specialized knowledge about fertility, contraception, pregnancy management, and the treatment of conditions that affected women specifically. Their work was essential but often undervalued by male physicians. and family members who didn't fully understand the complexity of women's health issues. Pediatric care required different skills and approaches than adult medicine. As household medical staff learned to diagnose and treat conditions that affected children specifically, they developed techniques for examining young patients who couldn't clearly communicate their symptoms. Medications that were safe and effective for growing bodies, and treatment approaches that took into account the different ways that children responded to illness and injury. The relationship between medicine and religion in Roman households was complex and pervasive, with medical practitioners incorporating prayers, rituals, and appeals to healing deities into their treatment protocols. They understood that psychological and spiritual factors affected healing outcomes and worked to address patients' emotional and religious needs. Alongside their physical symptoms, mental health and emotional well-being were recognized as important aspects of overall health by Roman medical practitioners, who developed treatments for conditions that would now be classified as depression, anxiety, and various forms of psychological distress. These treatments often combined practical interventions like diet and exercise with counseling, social support, and spiritual practices designed to restore emotional balance. Preventive medicine was an important focus for household physicians, who worked to maintain family health through dietary recommendations, exercise programs, environmental modifications, and lifestyle advice designed to prevent illness rather than just treat it after it occurred. They understood that prevention was more effective and less costly than treatment, and they developed comprehensive approaches to health maintenance that addressed multiple risk factors. The training and education of medical personnel in Roman households involved a combination of formal instruction, apprenticeship, relationships, and self-directed learning that allowed practitioners to develop and maintain their skills throughout their careers. Senior physicians served as mentors for junior staff, sharing knowledge and experience while ensuring that medical care met appropriate standards of quality and safety. Medical record keeping and patient documentation were important aspects of household healthcare, with physicians maintaining detailed records of symptoms, treatments, and outcomes that allowed them to track patient progress and refine their therapeutic approaches. These records also served as teaching tools and references for treating similar conditions in other patients. Emergency medical care required household physicians to be prepared for accidents, sudden illnesses, and medical crises that could occur at any time. They maintained supplies of emergency medications, surgical instruments, and other equipment necessary for rapid response to medical emergencies. And they trained other household staff in basic first aid and emergency procedures. The economics of household medical care involved complex calculations of the costs and benefits of different treatment approaches, the value of maintaining healthy staff and family members, and the investment required to maintain medical supplies and equipment. Wealthy households often spent significant resources on healthcare, viewing it as essential for protecting their human and financial investments. Diagnostic techniques used by Roman physicians were sophisticated for their time, involving careful observation of symptoms, physical examination procedures, analysis of bodily fluids, and interpretation of various signs that could indicate underlying health conditions. These physicians developed systematic approaches to diagnosis that combined empirical observation with theoretical understanding of human anatomy and physiology. Pain management was an important aspect of Roman medical practice, with physicians developing various techniques for reducing suffering associated with illness, injury, and surgical procedures. They used combinations of herbal medications, physical therapies, psychological support, and environmental modifications to help patients manage pain and discomfort during treatment and recovery. Infectious disease control in Roman households required understanding of how diseases spread and practical measures for preventing transmission among household members and staff. Medical practitioners developed quarantine procedures, sanitation protocols, and treatment approaches that could limit the spread of contagious illnesses while providing care for affected individuals. Geriatric care for elderly household members involved specialized knowledge about the health problems that affected aging individuals, and treatment approaches that took into account the different ways that older adults responded to medications and therapies. Household physicians developed comprehensive approaches to elderly care that addressed physical, mental, and social needs of aging family members and staff. The relationship between household physicians and other medical practitioners in the broader Roman community involved professional networks, continuing education opportunities, and collaborative relationships that allowed them to stay current with medical developments and consult with colleagues about difficult cases. These relationships were essential for maintaining professional competence and providing the best possible care for patients. Ethical issues in Roman medical practice included questions about the appropriate limits of treatment, the rights and responsibilities of physicians toward their patients, and the balance between individual patient needs and broader household interests. Medical practitioners had to navigate these ethical complexities while maintaining their professional integrity and serving the interests of their employers. Quality assurance in household medical care involved ongoing evaluation of treatment outcomes, continuous improvement of medical procedures, and accountability measures that ensured physicians met appropriate standards of competence and professional behavior. Households with reputations for excellent medical care attracted the best practitioners and provided superior health services for their members. The physical and emotional demands of medical practice in Roman households were considerable, requiring practitioners to maintain high levels of knowledge and skill while dealing with the stress of making life and death decisions, managing difficult patients and families, and working within resource constraints that limited their treatment options. Research and innovation in household medical practice occurred through careful observation of treatment outcomes, experimentation with new therapeutic approaches, and documentation of medical knowledge that could be shared with other practitioners. Some household physicians made significant contributions to medical knowledge through their clinical work and research activities. End-of-life care was an important aspect of household medical practice, with physicians providing comfort care, pain management, and emotional support for dying patients and their families. They developed approaches to terminal care that emphasized dignity, comfort, and spiritual preparation while acknowledging the limits of medical intervention. as we observe these medical practitioners moving through Roman households, examining patients, preparing medications, performing procedures, and providing the healthcare services that maintained family health and well-being. We see how their work combined scientific knowledge with compassionate care, technical skill with human understanding. Their contributions to Roman society extended far beyond individual patient care to include advancement of medical knowledge, training of future practitioners, and development of healthcare systems that served as models for later civilizations. And their intimate knowledge of human suffering and healing, their daily encounters with birth and death, health and illness, naturally brings us to those other household staff who dealt with life's transitions and transformations. The religious specialists and ritual practitioners who helped Roman families navigate the spiritual dimensions of their existence, while maintaining the sacred obligations that connected them to the gods, ancestors, and community traditions that gave meaning to Roman life. From the chambers where physicians treated bodies, we turn to the spaces where other specialists tended to souls. The religious practitioners and ritual experts who maintained the spiritual life of Roman households while serving as intermediaries between families and the complex pantheon of gods, spirits, and divine forces that Romans believed influenced every aspect of their existence, from birth to death and beyond. Religious observance in Roman households was not a weekly obligation but a daily necessity that permeated every aspect of family life, from morning prayers and offerings to evening rituals that secured divine protection through the night. Household religious specialists were responsible for maintaining this constant communication with the divine world, ensuring that appropriate ceremonies were performed at the right times and in the correct manner to secure divine favor and avoid supernatural punishment. Or household shrine was the focal point of domestic religious activity, typically located in the atrium where it could be easily accessed by family members and staff throughout the day. Religious specialists maintained these shrines, keeping them clean and properly supplied with offerings, fresh flowers, incense, and other materials necessary for daily rituals. They also supervised the household calendar of religious observances, ensuring that important festivals and sacred days were properly celebrated. Particularly Greek slaves who brought knowledge of mystery religions, philosophical traditions, and esoteric practices that appealed to Romans seeking deeper spiritual experiences than traditional state religion provided. These practitioners served as counselors, spiritual directors, and interpreters of divine will for families who wanted more personalized religious guidance than public temples could offer. Divination and fortune-telling were regular activities in Roman households, with religious specialists using various techniques to interpret divine messages and predict future events that might affect family fortunes. They read omens in the flight patterns of birds, examined animal entrails for divine signs, interpreted dreams and unusual occurrences, and consulted various oracular texts, methods to provide guidance for important decisions, funeral and burial. Preparations required specialized knowledge of the religious rituals and legal requirements that governed death and mourning in Roman society. Household religious practitioners oversaw the complex ceremonies that began immediately after death and continued through the burial process and mourning period. ensuring that the deceased received proper spiritual preparation for the afterlife and that survivors fulfilled their religious obligations to the dead. Seasonal festivals and religious celebrations were major undertakings that required extensive planning and coordination to ensure proper observance. Religious specialists organized these events, prepared necessary ritual materials, trained household staff in their ceremonial roles, and supervised the complex activities that could last for days and involve elaborate feasts, sacrifices, processions, and various forms of religious entertainment. Mystery religions and esoteric spiritual practices flourished in Roman households, particularly among educated families who were attracted to the more personal and emotionally satisfying experiences offered by cults of Isis, Mithras, Dionysus, and other deities imported from across the empire. Household religious specialists often served as initiates or priests in these mystery cults, providing access to secret knowledge and transformative spiritual experiences. Protective, magic, and apotropaic rituals were essential aspects of household religious practice, designed to ward off evil influences, protect family members from supernatural harm, and maintain the spiritual boundaries that separated domestic space from dangerous external forces. Religious practitioners created and maintained protective amulets, performed purification ceremonies, and supervised various forms of defensive magic that were believed to safeguard households against malevolent spirits and human enemies. Medical and healing practices often involved religious components that required the expertise of spiritual practitioners who understood the connections between physical illness and supernatural causes. These practitioners performed healing rituals, prepared blessed remedies, and provided spiritual counseling for patients who believed their ailments had religious or magical origins that required spiritual as well as medical treatment. Ancestor veneration was a central aspect of Roman domestic religion that required ongoing attention to the spirits of deceased family members who were believed to influence the fortunes of their living descendants. Religious specialists maintained ancestor shrines, performed regular offerings and ceremonies honoring the dead, and served as intermediaries between living family members and their deceased relatives who remained active participants in household spiritual life. Birth and childhood rituals marked important transitions in young Romans' lives and required careful attention to the religious requirements that would ensure divine protection and proper spiritual development. Household religious practitioners oversaw naming ceremonies, purification rituals, coming-of-age celebrations, and various protective rites that marked children's progress through the stages of physical and spiritual development. Marriage ceremonies and domestic rituals surrounding relationships required expertise in the complex religious requirements that governed Roman family formation and dissolution. Religious specialists supervised wedding ceremonies, performed rituals designed to ensure fertility and marital harmony, and provided spiritual guidance for couples navigating the challenges of married life within the constraints of Roman law and custom. Agricultural and seasonal observances connected household religious practice to the natural cycles that governed farming, weather, and food production throughout the Roman world. Religious practitioners organized ceremonies honoring agricultural deities, performed rituals designed to ensure good harvests and favorable weather, and maintained the spiritual connections between urban households and the rural environments that supplied their food and raw materials. Business and financial rituals were important aspects of household religious practice for families whose wealth depended on trade, manufacturing, or other commercial activities. Religious specialists performed ceremonies designed to secure divine favor for business ventures, blessed new enterprises and partnerships, and provided spiritual guidance for families making important economic decisions that could affect their long-term prosperity. Political and social rituals connected household, religious practice, political life of Roman society. Religious practitioners supervised ceremonies that marked family members' entry into public office, blessed political alliances and social relationships, and maintained the spiritual dimensions of family, honor, and reputation that were essential for success in Roman public life. Travel and journey rituals were necessary preparations for family members and staff who traveled throughout the Roman world for business, political, or personal reasons. Religious specialists performed protective ceremonies, prepared blessed items for travelers to carry, and organized rituals designed to ensure safe travel and successful outcomes for important journeys and missions. Educational and intellectual activities often had religious dimensions that required spiritual guidance and ritual support. Household religious practitioners blessed educational endeavors, supervised ceremonies marking academic achievements, and provided spiritual context for learning activities that connected intellectual development to broader questions of wisdom, virtue, and divine purpose. Health and longevity rituals were ongoing concerns for households that wanted to maintain the physical and spiritual well-being of all family members and staff. Religious practitioners performed regular ceremonies designed to promote health and prevent illness, organized special rituals for family members facing health crises, and provided spiritual support for those dealing with chronic conditions or approaching death. Legal and judicial rituals connected household religious practice to the Roman legal system that governed family relationships, property rights, and social obligations. Religious practitioners supervised oath-taking ceremonies, blessed legal documents and agreements, and provided spiritual guidance for families involved in legal disputes or other judicial proceedings. Military and warfare rituals were important for households with members serving in Roman military forces or involved in conflicts that could affect family security and prosperity. Religious specialists performed ceremonies designed to secure divine protection for soldiers, blessed weapons, and military equipment, and organized rituals that supported family members during times of military service and combat. The training and education of religious practitioners involved lengthy apprenticeships, formal instruction in ritual procedures, an ongoing study of theological texts and spiritual traditions that provided the knowledge necessary for effective religious leadership. Master practitioners served as mentors for junior staff, sharing secret knowledge and ceremonial expertise that was essential for maintaining the quality and authenticity of household religious observances. As we follow these religious specialists through their daily rounds of prayers and offerings, their seasonal celebrations and life cycle ceremonies, their constant attention to the spiritual dimensions of Roman existence, we see how their work connected individual households to the vast network of divine relationships that Romans believed governed their world. Their expertise in ritual and ceremony, their knowledge of divine will and supernatural forces, provided the spiritual framework within which all other household activities took place, and their role as mediators between the human and divine worlds naturally brings us to our final exploration of household life. The evening rituals and nighttime routines that brought each day to a close and prepared households for the vulnerable hours of darkness, when spiritual protection was most needed, when the boundaries between waking and sleeping, life and death, human and divine, became most permeable, and when the entire complex system of Roman domestic life prepared itself for renewal in the approaching dawn, as darkness falls over the Roman household and the day's activities wind toward their close, we enter the most intimate and vulnerable time in Roman domestic life. When families and their staff gathered for the evening, rituals that would secure divine protection through the night and prepare everyone for the restoration and renewal that sleep was supposed to bring to both body and spirit. Transition from day to night in Roman households was marked by elaborate routines that served both practical and spiritual purposes. Dangers that Romans believed flourished in darkness. The lighting ceremony was often supervised by religious specialists who ensured that each lamp was properly blessed and positioned to provide maximum spiritual as well as physical protection. Evening prayers and offerings at the household lararium were the spiritual centerpiece of Roman nighttime routines, when family members and staff gathered to thank the gods for the day's blessings, seek protection for the coming night, and make requests for divine favor in the following day's activities. These ceremonies reinforced family solidarity while acknowledging the household's dependence on divine goodwill for continued prosperity and safety. The evening meal, when wealthy families dined together, was both a social and religious occasion that required careful attention to proper etiquette, appropriate offerings to household deities, and the maintenance of family harmony that was believed to influence divine favor. Household staff responsible for food preparation and service worked to create an atmosphere of abundance and celebration that honored both human guests and the invisible divine presence that Romans believed attended all family gatherings. Personal grooming and hygiene routines in the evening were elaborate affairs that required the services of multiple specialists who helped family members transition from their public personas to their private selves. Body slaves assisted with bathing, hair care, and the application of oils and perfumes that were believed to have protective as well as cosmetic properties. These intimate services created bonds of trust and dependence that were central to household social dynamics. Bedtime preparation involved complex rituals designed to ensure restful sleep and protection from the supernatural threats that Romans believed were most active during the vulnerable hours of unconsciousness. Beds were blessed and protected with amulets, herbs, and prayers, while sleeping spaces were arranged to provide maximum security against both human intruders and malevolent spirits that might disturb sleep or invade dreams. Night watch duties were assigned to household staff who remained alert while others slept, maintaining fires, guarding against intruders, and performing the ongoing maintenance tasks that kept households functioning safely through the hours of darkness. These workers developed their own communities and traditions, sharing the unique challenges and responsibilities that came with protecting sleeping families and maintaining households' security during the most dangerous hours. Evening entertainment in wealthy households often continued well into the night, with musicians, storytellers, and other performers providing cultured amusements that demonstrated family sophistication, while creating pleasant atmospheres for socializing and relaxation. Household entertainers developed specialized skills for evening performance, understanding how to create moods and experiences appropriate for the intimate settings of nighttime family gatherings. Educational activities continued into the evening hours, with tutors and pedagogues supervising study sessions, discussion groups, and cultural activities that extended the day's formal learning into more relaxed, but still intellectually stimulating evening programs. These sessions often focused on subjects like philosophy, literature, and rhetoric that were considered appropriate for contemplative evening reflection. Business and administrative activities that required privacy and concentration were often conducted during evening hours when households were quieter and family heads could focus on important decisions without the interruptions and distractions that characterized daytime activities. Secretaries and financial advisors worked closely with their employers during these sessions, handling confidential matters that required discretion and careful attention to detail. Medical care and health monitoring continued through the evening hours, with physicians and health attendants checking on patients, administering evening medications, and preparing treatments that would continue through the night. Evening was considered an important time for health assessment. When the day's activities had revealed any developing problems and when preventive measures could be implemented before sleep security arrangements for nighttime protection involved coordination between household staff and external guards who worked together to maintain the physical safety that allowed families to sleep peacefully. These security systems required careful planning and constant vigilance, as Roman houses were vulnerable to both criminal intrusion and the various forms of social violence that could threaten wealthy families and their possessions. Crafts and specialized work that required good lighting or quiet concentration were often scheduled for evening hours when artisans could work without interruption, and when the cooler temperatures made detailed manual labor more comfortable. Evening workshops became centers of household productivity, where skilled workers created the luxury goods and artistic objects that enhanced family prestige and provided income from sales to other wealthy households. Child care responsibilities intensified during evening hours, when young family members required supervision, entertainment, and preparation for sleep that would restore their energy for the following day's activities. Nurses and childminders developed specialized techniques for managing evening routines that met children's physical and emotional needs while maintaining the household discipline that parents expected. Seasonal variations in evening routines reflected the changing patterns of daylight and social activities that characterized different times of the Roman year. Summer evenings allowed for outdoor activities and extended socializing that took advantage of pleasant temperatures and longer daylight hours, while winter evenings focused more on indoor gatherings and activities that provided warmth and social connection during the coldest and darkest months. Evening correspondence and communication activities connected Roman households to the broader networks of family, friends, and business associates that sustained their social and economic relationships. Secretaries and messengers worked through the evening hours to maintain the constant flow of information and social contact that was essential for success in Roman society. Religious observances that were specific to nighttime hours included prayers and rituals designed to secure protection during sleep, ceremonies honoring nocturnal deities, and spiritual practices that took advantage of the quiet and introspective atmosphere that evening provided for contemplation and communion with divine forces. Food, preservation, and kitchen management activities continued through the evening hours as household staff prepared for the following day's meals, preserved perishable foods, and maintained the complex systems of food storage and preparation that were necessary for feeding large household populations. Evening kitchen work required specialized knowledge about food safety and preservation techniques that could prevent waste and maintain quality. Financial planning and household administration were often conducted during evening hours when family heads could review accounts, plan expenditures, and make decisions about household management without the pressures and distractions of daytime activities. These sessions required the expertise of financial advisors and administrative staff who could provide accurate information and sound advice about household resources and obligations. As the final oil lamps were extinguished and the household settled into the quiet rhythms of night, Roman families and their staff completed another day in their complex dance of survival, service, and aspiration within one of history's most sophisticated urban civilizations. The evening routines that ended each day were more than simple practical necessities. They were expressions of Roman values about family, security, spirituality, and social order that shaped every aspect of their domestic experience. The vulnerable hours of sleep that followed these evening preparations were themselves protected by the careful arrangements and spiritual practices that had marked the transition from day to night. Roman households understood that survival and prosperity required constant attention to both practical and supernatural threats, and their elaborate evening routines reflected this understanding in every detail of their domestic lives. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new expressions of the complex relationships between masters and servants, family members and household staff, individual needs and collective obligations that defined Roman domestic life. But for now, as darkness settled over the eternal city and its countless households, the careful preparations of evening had created spaces of relative safety and rest where Romans of all social levels could find temporary refuge from the demanding realities of their hierarchical and often harsh society. In these quiet hours, surrounded by the protective rituals and practical arrangements that had ended another Roman day. Household members could dream of better futures while resting from the labors that sustained their present circumstances. And in the morning, they would rise to begin the cycle again, carrying forward the traditions, relationships, and aspirations that connected them to the vast story of Roman civilization that we continue to study, admire, and learn from today.